Look at the light. Amazing. I do not know whether this will work out too well. The connection is dodgy today, which is pretty rare actually for some reason, but I keep dropping out in the middle of stuff I'm trying to do. So we'll see where we get. Well, one thing I've done in the last couple of weeks is to realize that I really needed to curate my backlog of email, which would be longer, except due to crashes and purges and so on. But it goes back this little account that I had way off on kind of some strange little hosting service, which is what I use for my email. It's not hooked up to Google or anything, um, and it goes all the way back to 2006. The email itself I know goes back to 2000, but the records go back to 2006. And I diligently erase all the crap as it comes in, always have. And I had created some folders to stick stuff in, but I didn't make a habit of it, and realized that I better make a habit of it, and that I was losing old information and couldn't find anything. So I decided, all right, it's time to actually create a folders library, and realized that in the old messages folder were 35,000 messages. And this, well aware that I had been spam filtering and junking further crap the entire time, like practically daily. So this is 35,000 majority, potentially meaningful emails. Well, okay, start at the beginning, go through and start creating the right kind of folders. Instantly discovered all sorts of topics or categories. Didn't want to overdo it, like the old publishing stuff for Adept Press just became like old Adept Press is the folder or something like that. Stuff about all the kids schooling gets going. Well, the kids were born in the first twins were born in 2007. So obviously the email records, now most of this is my personal email, not academic. And so like all the friends and all the bank stuff and house stuff, I mean, your whole life basically, as well as all the role-playing stuff. All of this, I mean, it's just insane to relive as you're going through. There will be a whole exchange with someone and you're kind of like, that's funny. I think of this person as somebody that I've been interacting with in the last 5 years, regarding some activity. And it turns out, we had this whole interaction, 15 years ago, which I suppose is important to them. Who knew? Right. So anyway, I'm grunting my way through, and it forces you to relive stuff. I mean, it forces you to relive the birth of your kids and the negotiations about this stuff, and then early preschool and other kids' birth and all sorts of things, all the interactions of people you're socializing with and the ups and downs, and those relationships are all reflected in the emails. And since you're going kind of daily, historically speaking, it's just really, really a grind in some ways and experiential. I don't really recommend it, actually. It's a little too detail oriented. I never could understand those biographers who would go through 19th century or 18th century person's voluminous letters. They would have enormous thousands, hundreds of thousands of letters, and the biographer diligently sits down and and it takes a certain kind of personality to do that. This sort of vicarious devouring of someone else's life and semi experiencing it. And I can't do that. I mean, for anyone else, and to do it for myself is bad enough. Now, what's weird is that other kinds of equivalent behaviors that I've done, I've found incredibly important and valuable. One of them was about, let's count on my fingers. If I was teaching then I'd say about 5 years into my university teaching, as a graduate student at that time. I took back then we got all our evaluations in hard copy. And what the students wrote, and the little summaries of the numbers that they had put down and everything. And I had, being the pack rat that I am, I had always stacked them, kind of in order, and had, even at the time, having a decent filing cabinet, had actually kept a fairly good record. Well, I said, well, it's time. And I went and I read them from the start to the present and learned an immense amount about how I teach and what the experience of being in my class is like. And it's just remarkable. It was an amazing experience. I was like, wow, look, I've changed at doing this. They used to complain about that. They stopped complaining about that, started praising me about it. Oh, and look, I'm doing this. Well, that's crap. You don't see it if you're just checking out the evaluations at the end of every term and just blowing on as a wavefront. You look at this and you actually start seeing things that matter. And so during 25 years of academia, I made that a routine, not too often. That was the important point. You don't want to do this every year. That's the units are too short. You need chunks. So every few years, I would do that. And sometimes I would actually go back to the beginning, to do it every so often, slightly less often, but I would do that too. And it really made a difference. I mean, right up to the very end of my academic career, I really felt like I was always processing how I taught. And even if I didn't sit down and make like a little to-do and self-evaluation kind of thing at the end, which I tended not to, I knew that my brain was working on this. And then I would go into how I'm going to teach now would be altered. Now, I'm sure that certain other profs have done this or do it, and that's great if you do. It perturbed me that I mentioned it once to a colleague that I did that, and their kind of defensive striking back about it, and the strong implication that they did not do this, and that they struck back very defensively about it. And I realized I better not bring this up. I bet anybody that I say this to who doesn't do it is really going to feel punked or something. And usually academics are real passive aggressive about how they do this. They'll say something like, well, I guess you have a lot of time on your hands, or something like that. And I kind of realized that I couldn't really discuss this, but I bring it up here because it's an example of this kind of archival and again, sort of devouring or internalization. It's your own life, but there is this kind of weird vicarious feel about it. And it's very time-stamped. And I personally have a very strong impression from every single time I teach a course. And even if you get a little vague about that in the time units that I'm talking about, you really remember, okay, this was that winter, and you're looking at it, and it's very contextual. So whatever's going on cognitively about that is pretty strong. I knew it had a big impact on me. Well, you would think that doing this for basically the life of my kids as one of the primary variables, and then the course of my interactions with this website, The Forge, which I was running at that time for the second half of The Forge's life, the ups and downs of publishing my games, and then the visits to Sweden, moving in as time went by, moving into things like developing my book on evolution for writing and publication, all the interactions about that. So, these things are all getting folders, and some of them had folders already, and I'm just putting things where they go. I found myself making a new folder called To Sweden, right? So in goes all that stuff. And going through all that's really interesting. I mean, you recognize just how traumatic a particular period was, or you recognize how good you felt about a particular thing through the course of this time period, or how into something that you were, how committed you were to it. And you can be kind of sad about that when you're like, wow, I used to really be into that. Well, all these things, I mean, it just goes really deeply into them, and it's exhausting. I can only do so many. You'll be pleased to know that I have actually busted it down over the last few weeks. I've busted it down to under 4,000 left to go. They're slowing down though, because those are fairly recent. Those are, I mean, of course, are relive the move to Sweden, relive all of the logistics and all of the hassles and the storage and the shipping and the, you can just imagine, you can see a shift from assessing houses for purchase to repairing the one that we got without having to purchase it. You can see the real huge turnover in the kinds of emails and information that we're gathering, the negotiations that we're having. You can see us get here. You can see the school thing kick in and the interactions. And looking back at some of those emails, I understand them way better than I did at the time. And I'm like, oh God, I dropped the ball on that. I had no idea what that whole exchange was actually supposed to be about. Anyway, it's harder actually as I'm nearing the present. There are aspects. Living through Kickstarters, by the way, is horrific. I despise running Kickstarters. And the last one that I did was actually not of my choice, because I was working with another publisher and they insisted that they needed to run a Kickstarter campaign. And I was like, please, no. But they did. And you can just see the agony that I'm going through and how much I hate it. And, the Kickstarter updates, and this, people contacting me through the Kickstarter and considerations of, managing it and everything. And you can see all my emails about it. And I'm just like hating life throughout every step right there. All kinds of stuff. So I'm finding that actually a little more of a slog. I could go through, back in 2009, you're kind of like, oh, look, 2009. And some of it's kind of this painful reliving. Some of it's really interested. It's separate from you a little bit. So, putting everything into the folders has a kind of nice sense of completion. Now doing stuff from, 2015, 2016, oh no, more like stuff 2018, 2019 now. I'm just, I don't, that's too recent. I don't really feel like reliving that stuff at all. But considering, the speed at which it's going at this time, though, I need to make a bunch of new folders that are much more relevant to life in Sweden. And so I'm going to have to, recurate at this point. In a big way, I will say, doing this as if I didn't already need one, or as if I had thought that I had done this already, this feeling of severance is profound. That is one thing I'm getting out of this. That transition, moving from the States to Sweden and knowing it's a permanent move, the sense of severance right there by doing this is, I don't know, maybe I am breathing a little more freely from that. You'll have to ask me in a little while, especially when the whole thing is actually done, whether that was a good thing to do, whether I'm glad I did it, or whether it was just sort of this, kind of awful chore that I took some while and successfully completed. I hope it's the positive. Well, anyway, if you haven't done that with all of your electronic stuff and this and that, then all I have to say is get to it, because if you wait longer, it's going to be worse. So, it takes a certain amount of obsessive intensity that I really ought to be bringing to something else rather than this, even to do it. But I can't say that I can promise you, when you do that you're going to be enriched or anything. You might know yourself a little better, but I'm not quite sure that that's the same thing as self-enrichment, believe me. All right, that is what it is for today. Notice, it's actually after 3 p.m. and there's daylight coming through the windows, which is kind of nice. We call this a long day around here at this point. That aside, best wishes.